Hello and welcome to She Leads Collective podcast. I'm Mary Gregory and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is a space for honest conversations about what it really means to lead as a woman today and how we can all show up with more courage, care and clarity. You'll hear from inspiring women, powerful allies and bold truth tellers who are changing the game, not by playing tougher, but by leading smarter, softer and stronger. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the She Leads Collective podcast. So when we talk about gender equity at work, how often do we pause to consider equity according to whose cultural rules? Because gender equity is never one-dimensional. It's shaped not just by organisational culture, but by nationality, religion, upbringing, and deeply embedded beliefs about gender roles and power. For women working in organisations today, those layers can collide in complex ways, particularly when you're considering global organisations. This influences how safe it feels to speak up, to challenge, to lead visibly, or to claim authority. Well, my guest today brings a powerful and practical lens to this very conversation, because today I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Rennoldson, best-selling author, multi-award-winning coach, speaker, and the founder of Culture Cuppa, a consultancy that specialises in global leadership, communication, and cultural intelligence. And Victoria works with organisations and leaders all over the world to help people collaborate and lead more effectively across cultures. Victoria is also the author of Become a Global Leader, where she explores how leaders can adapt their communication, presence, and leadership style to succeed in multicultural environments without losing themselves in the process. In this conversation, I'm hoping that we'll explore how culture shapes gender expectations at work, why some women face a double bind in global organisations, and how leaders can build gender equitable cultures that don't simply ask the minority to adapt, but instead create shared understanding, dialogue and choice. Victoria, thank you so much for joining me today.
Mary, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to the show. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too, because I think that it's so nuanced and so multi-layered, the things that we're going to be talking about. It's absolutely fascinating because, the whole thing about unconscious bias and gender equity, that in itself is a challenge. And then you put another layer of culture over that. And, it's a whole other layer of learning, in actual fact. So let's hear a bit more about you, though, first of all, because I'm really curious about what got you into, or what's your background that got you into moving into the world of helping leaders and organisations develop a much more gender equitable space. But tell me first about you and your story.
Absolutely. Well, I've always been very passionate about the idea of communication and culture from my early days at school, learning languages and at university. But then my first career was in brand marketing in global organizations. So I was working, first of all, in healthcare, and then later on in the food industry, in FMCG, fast moving consumer goods. And I was working in large global teams based in the UK, but leading teams across Europe, working with teams in the US, in Asia. And I got to see during that 12-year experience across multiple brands and organizations, how global teams work, but also how they don't work. And I got really interested because of my passion for language and communication and understanding the nuances of communication. I got really interested in what happens when leaders are communicating, what's happening within meeting rooms where people are saying yes, but you leave the meeting room and then suddenly it's no. What is happening in the cultural dynamics? And, that glimmer of curiosity, that glimmer of interest in all these areas led me down a path that when I decided it was, marketing had run its course, I was looking for something new and different. I felt that insight around understanding how global teams work, how global leadership works as well. For me, this was really an area that I wanted to help in, both for individuals and for teams as well. And that has what I've been doing ever since that moment. So this is my 11th year in business. I work with individuals, teams around the world, virtually and in person. I'm based in London, the UK, like yourself. And I'm really helping people think about, how do they navigate culture? How do they connect, collaborate, really think about the dynamics that are in the room, hidden or overt, that are influencing the way that people are showing up, speaking, connecting with each
I
other.
hear then that it really is from very much personal experience and the love of what you were doing when we were working on those global teams as well, that you really, really enjoyed that. And but also it really sparked your curiosity to want to learn more and to understand more. That is a great story. And so it brings you to into the whole space of, what is culture? And, is culture just something like, someone might be French, so they're going to have a different culture to us, or is it something else? What actually contributes to culture and the differences that we experience?
Well, I love that question, because one small word, culture, means different things to people. Like when I ask this question in the facilitation and workshops that I do, you get so many different levels of this. And this is sometimes the tricky thing. We talk about culture, we think we know what we're talking about in an environment like business or corporate organizations. But quite honestly, we're not being clear what we mean. Because cultural identity, yes, of course, could mean about your national culture and where you identify there. But it's also about all the multiple layers of your cultural identity. So, for example, I could say that I am British. That is one level of my identity. But I very much strongly identify as a Londoner. I identify as a woman. That matters to me. That means something to me. I'm a parent. I'm a business owner, and so on. And for other people, that might be about their generation, their religion, their even the department they work in. Like some people have really strong cultural identities that are associated with the fact that they work in sales or they work in finance, and that really influences the way that they are. So this is where it gets complex, because as you can see, we can't just say, oh, all the French are like this, or all the women are like that, because that isn't a nonsense. Clearly, we are individuals and we all show up in our individual cultural identities.
It is so multi-layered, influenced by our backgrounds, where we grew up, um, our religion, not just our gender. So many different facets actually influence this. So how do why is it so easy for leaders to underestimate then the influence of culture, especially when they maybe want to be being more inclusive as a leader?
I think it comes down to this, that actually there's a sense of, like, let's talk about gender now. This idea of, there is one way of doing this. There is one way of meeting the needs of all of this population that identify perhaps as female, as women. And of course, this is really tricky because there will be very, very different needs. And I mean, to illustrate this, I'll take a really interesting example, which is often in my work, I'm asked about this question of assertiveness. How can I be more assertive in the workplace, right? But here's the really fascinating thing. There are different spectrums on this. And clearly the gender expectations might come into that, but it can be cultural too. So for one reason that I'm asked that question is, the next question is, but how do I know I'm not being arrogant or aggressive with my assertiveness? And that might be coming from somebody who has a behavioral preference for avoiding confrontation. They might be somebody who operates from a cultural background where power distance, so hierarchy, really matters, and therefore they're very aware of power dynamics in the room. So that, or even about communication style, direct or indirect communication style. But equally, I've been asked that question from somebody who is saying, well, I've been given the feedback that I'm bossy. So how can I be assertive, but not bossy? And this was also a woman, but coming from a very different cultural background where her direct communication style was perceived in the context in the UK as bossy. But in her home cultural context, when she was very successful as a leader in France, that wasn't perceived in that way. It was seen as direct, honest, to the point, sharp. And this is kind of really the tricky here, that, there is no one size fits all. So it really is then about, okay, who are the women, or who are the people who identify as women in your organization? What is it they need? Who are the individuals, and how do you best support them?
And I suppose what I'm hearing there is it is about societal expectations as well, because what you're talking about there is bias too, that, we in the UK, for example, not just the UK, but more Western society, there is a bias towards, if a man is assertive, he's seen as a leader. If a woman is assertive, she's seen as bossy. And that is a very well researched piece of information. But I'm also curious about, and this is quite a sensitive one, really, but I work often with global organizations. I'll be running women's leadership programs with people from over in the US, with people from the Middle East, with people from different countries all over the world. And I can remember in one particular program, the women that were from the Middle East, the cultural difference actually was impacting their ability to use what they were learning from the program. So, for example, we were teaching them to say no, for example. And that wasn't okay, because as women, they should be more submissive and be more facilitative of others rather than setting boundaries for themselves. Um, and so that got, that really got us having a useful conversation in that particular program. But it also made me think, as a facilitator, how do I make sure that, people's different cultures and different needs are taken care of? And also, we're not putting people into compromised positions either, because, the culture for those people in the Middle East was much more, you do as I say from the male perspective, and you are submissive towards me. So as a cultural expert,
Yeah.
how do you approach that situation?
I think that's a brilliant example. And I think, there are things like power distance that are playing into that, expectations of women and the role they play in society in general, in the workplace, and what that looks like when it comes to details like contribution, about speaking up, um, challenging others. And I think this is where, when we're thinking, particularly at like a global organization level, like what's the right thing to be doing? What is it we want to bring into the organization that aligns with the mission, the values of the organization? It's then really considering like two things. One is, how do you facilitate that? So not everybody will be able to, let's say, contribute in the same way. It's like just in the same way, just saying, oh, well, just speak up is not very helpful, but you need to create the mechanisms, the systems, the conversations to do that. And that's where I talk about in my work, designing conversations, really thinking about whether it's you're facilitating a workshop, whether you are inviting a group to have a conversation around a topic that's sensitive like this, whether it's about actually in smaller groups, really understanding what's going to work with the cultural dynamics that are in the room, virtual or not, virtual or in person. And that's where you need to think about, how do you encourage contribution and conversation about this topic? That might not be in a big open forum. That might be very appropriate in forums where the majority or everybody in that room feels able to express themselves, feels psychologically safe to do so, but also culturally feel very confident to do that. The risk of it, though, is that if you sort of have a group of people who have very different behavioral preferences in this, you just might hear from the dominant voices. You may not hear from everybody. So whether you're a leader, whether you're a facilitator, whether you're trying to create those spaces, it's really designing them to enable the contribution. So that for me is the first part. And then the second part, which I think you touched on, which is so critical to this, is about implementation, the action that sits behind this. So you can have the strategies, you can have all the concepts and ideas about what either an individual is going to change, or alternatively, a leader is going to do for the team to create a more equitable experience for everybody. But then the strategy piece is really considering, with the insight into the cultural dynamics. And in my work, we use tools like there's a 4-stage framework to cultural intelligence. There are behavioral preferences to talk about with a non-judgmental language, the language of difference. So where are the different approaches and what's going on there behaviorally and from a communication point of view? But you have to get to see what's called CQ strategy in my work. So really understanding what is it you need to adapt when you implement this? What is going to work in the reality of the situation that you're in? And that's where, you really need to be nuanced and say, well, it may not be a case of, say, openly challenging the other, say, the more male-dominated room openly in front of everybody. Maybe it's about what needs to happen, again, in designing conversations in smaller groups, one-to-one. What happens before the meeting and after the meeting, rather than necessarily what happens in it itself.
So allowing some structure, so the design provides a structure that allows for smaller conversations to then gradually contribute to a bigger conversation. But that the whole element of psychological safety is fundamental to that, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. And I think, the other thing that I can imagine, people listening to this might be asking themselves is, well, this sounds like you've got to spend quite a bit of time and invest time in the, slowing down this conversation arc to then get to, what might be the ultimate impact of this. And my answer to that is yes, you're investing in relationships, trust, you're investing in understanding what is the best way to navigate some of those cultural dynamics which are happening in the room, because ultimately that's going to bring you a better result, the trust, the relationship that allows you then to speed back up again. But if you go straight to it as, more direct in the confrontation style, you just may not get to the result you're looking for because it's perceived as, you're confronting the situation in a power dynamic that's not going to work, or a competitive environment that doesn't appreciate it.
And that's going to fundamentally hamper any trust building and creating a safe environment. What I'm hearing is the approach you're promoting is putting in some really strong foundations to the culture to be able to explore difference, to be able to understand each other better, to be able to be more explicit about expectations. But you have to make it safe for that to happen. And that it's like, you're not going to build a house just on sand, are you? You're going to make sure there are some really strong foundations in place so that house is a sturdy structure.
Absolutely. And it's led from, my view, it's got to be led from different levels within the organization. So it's not just down to the women to adapt and to lead the charge. It's, absolutely, there are really important things from a cultural point of view that might be helpful. And this is obviously the work you do, helping women in leadership. But for me, this work actually sits at all the levels within the organization, from top to down, bottom up. And when I've seen it work well, it's those global organizations that embrace the cultural intelligence at all levels. And it's part of the employee journey from their first moment in the organization all the way through. So as an example, I'm doing some work right now with a very large multinational organization, construction organization, and they are, cultural intelligence. I'm leading this for them as part of their monthly induction program. So every single employee of this huge multinational who, is coming and arriving in the UK, from the most sort of junior levels, people who have just entering the workforce all the way through to my senior managers, go through this induction, and that cultural intelligence sits the heart of that as well. And to me, that's really about, that's where you can see it gets exciting when organizations embrace it at all levels.
Yes, that sounds fantastic. And there's something there about it's really getting embedded. The fact they're using you that in that way, and right at the beginning when people are being inducted, they're getting a real sense of what's important to this organization. If that's part of their induction, that's really phenomenal. I'm also reminded that, my whole sense of, women programs, there's a whole debate around women only programs, and actually it is a huge benefit to women to have women only programs, but they've got to be part of the strategic approach of the organization. It's got to be owned and championed by every level of the organization. processes put in place that support the changes they want to see, senior leaders living it being part of the strategic dimension that they're heading towards. Unless it's done that way, it's not going to shift the culture. You're just going to be trying to fix the women if you don't do it from a strategic approach.
I absolutely hear that. And I think where I've seen it being done very successfully across different organizations is where it's, yes, aligned to strategy, but very aligned to the values of the organization as well, where respect, diversity sits the heart of the organization. And they don't see it as just words or just nice words on a nice slide or a poster or something they have, on their wall. They genuinely mean it. They make it part of, who they are. They understand as well the connection between those values of, like, respect is a key value of the organization I'm thinking of, that is tied into an imperative for them to grow their business. They know they can't do it. They can't grow their business. They can't actually achieve their really ambitious results unless they really ensure they're a diverse organization, unless they get this cultural intelligence piece right. And that is the link where I think organizations really who get it, really get it. Because this is more than words. It's more than soft skills or nice to have, or it's an adjunct to other things that are going on. Where it's really core is when organizations understand this is core to achieving the performance objectives of this organization and team. We can't get there unless we make this happen.
Yes, I totally agree. And it's very powerful what you're saying, Victoria, because it is about the behaviors, it's about bringing those values to life, and it's about creating the culture as a really positive lived experience for people. So they, when they come into that organization, they get a real sense of what it's like because of the lived experience. And that is something that's very accepting and supportive of diversity and difference, whether it's cultural, whether it's gender, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, you mentioned cultural intelligence when you were talking before. So tell me a bit more about that. You talk about it as it's not just a tick box exercise, but it's actually something that's an ongoing practice. Could you briefly explain what you mean by cultural intelligence?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that question, because I'm conscious I've mentioned it a few times, so it's good to really explain what I mean. So I think where I kind of seen perhaps sometimes in the past, the kind of the cultural training that goes on comes from a place sometimes of awareness of what is different, awareness of maybe even a bit of, do's and don'ts, like this would be helpful, this may not be helpful. And it's quite one dimensional. And so the work that I do in cultural intelligence is based on a framework, an approach developed by the Cultural Intelligence Centre, who I'm a certified facilitator with. And it's really about understanding that, yes, awareness is important, but nothing changes if you stop at awareness. In fact, there are 4 capabilities that are really important to this. So it is actually a capability. Cultural intelligence is something that you can measure, you can understand your strengths, your development areas in, and you can understand how to improve it. And there are 4 key capabilities together. It starts with what's called CQ. CQ is short for cultural intelligence, CQ drive. And this is the question of why? Why are you motivated to make this change? Why would you do this? What is it going to bring to the trust, to the relationships, to the business, as we were talking about earlier? What are the tangible results that you might get as a result of this? And, that why is critically important, because if you can't answer that question, doesn't matter how much awareness, training, or facilitation that goes on in an organization, it's not going to land. So the why has to matter at the organizational level, the team level, at the individual level. There has to be that motivation. From CQ drive, we then look at CQ knowledge. This is where we dig into this idea of what is different across cultures. So back to maybe the starting point in our conversation, how are women different across different cultures? You mentioned women in your experience with women from the Middle East. I've worked a lot with women from across Europe, but from Russia, from Eastern Europe, Baltics, but also women from Japan. At one point I was working with a lot of women from Japan. And again, some of the cultural norms, what is expected, what is acceptable, appropriate, is really wildly different. And, just an aside on this, I remember one of the stories talking to somebody I was working with. And I do believe, society is changing. So that's the other concept here. Culture is not static. It's always an evolution. But I remember her telling me about one organization she was working for in Japan a few years back, where they had stipulated these are the Pantone colors of tights you're allowed to wear. These are the Pantone colors of your hair you're allowed to dye your hair to. And to me, as somebody from the UK, I was deeply shocked by that. How can an organization tell you what to wear? Was my reaction. And then I realized that was my cultural norm. Now, my understanding is things have changed in Japan. That's evolving. Clearly, we have even legalities around that here in the UK. But we have to understand what is normal and acceptable here or in our own cultural context may be completely different for somebody else's lived experience. So that's really important. So knowledge, understanding through the 10 behavioral preferences, using a non-judgmental language to describe where are we different, what's coming up, what do we need to adapt to? But then we have to take it into strategies. So CQ strategy is then really making the choice. Do you as an individual adapt or don't you actually? Because this is the other thing that comes up. Is it always up to, for example, the woman to adapt her behavior? Is that what's needed? Or perhaps the person who's operating in the minority in the culture that is going on? That's a really big question. And it's the question I often get asked is, well, but why should I adapt? Should I do this? And I think it's really about the choice is really about the context and the group of people. What's going to be most effective for your impact, for your results? And you can choose not to adapt and be disruptive with that to create a particular tension and a particular point to that you are different. There is something different going on. And then finally, CQ action. The final capability is you've got to put it into action. You have to change what you're saying, how you're saying, body language, your voice, really thinking about the behavioral elements that show that change. So that's the 4 capabilities and the cultural intelligence approach together.
And so you use those 4 capabilities to guide you in the work you're doing. And I know you've written your book, Become a Global Leader. So do you go into more depth in your book about those 4 capabilities?
There's loads more depth in the book. And, when I'm working with organizations, often we're getting individuals to do their own personal profiles and get that feedback and understand their culture, because it's very difficult to see your own culture and recognize that you're operating in a certain way. And then the real magic happens when we map teams and we can see what's really going on. And of course, you can look at the detail at maybe gender level, but also at the very individual level. How are people similar and different? Where are potentially the clashes happening and the gaps in miscommunication, misunderstanding? What is it that, you do about that? So this is how I use it in my work.
Amazing. So, it's natural that there will be differences and that there will be clashes. And of course, as human beings, we're all very attached to our own ways of being and doing things. And, I believe my beliefs are the correct ones, yours are the wrong ones. We're very quick to make right and to make wrong. How do you approach those clashes where there is a difference? I can remember having somebody Dutch, and this is not demeaning to the Dutch because she was an amazing leader, but she was incredibly forthright and straight and, left other people in the room feeling, oh, but she just said it as it was. And it was very much her culture and how she'd been brought up. That she's just really straight. And in some ways that was a strength, but it also shocked people from different cultures, particularly we British, who weren't used to it. So how do you deal with those clashes?
I mean, this is exactly what it's about. It's about relativity. So I think, let's take that like communication style, direct, indirect. The point is we are all on a spectrum of culture. So it's not that we're one thing or another. there is a difference that goes on. So as an example, some of my Japanese, so let's take another dimension like expressiveness. Some people are much more expressive with their body language, with their voice, with the way that they express their emotions compared to others. So when I was working a lot with Japanese clients, I was very aware that I'm quite an expressive person. So I know everybody's listening to this, but Mary can see me and I'm quite mobile. So when I was working with Japanese clients, I was aware that I needed to almost sit on my hands at some moments, tone it down a bit, because from their point of view, perhaps I was coming across as a bit too loud, in inverted commas, in my body language. It was too dominant. It was too in their face, perhaps. And so I was aware that I needed to tone that down by almost like imagining a volume dial by a notch or two, just to make it easier to connect with me. But on the same scale, if you look at expressiveness, I'm not as expressive as potentially some of the clients I work with from Brazil or from Italy in the past. So it's always about relativity. So when the clashes come up, it's really understanding, why is this clash coming up? Which of these particular behavioral preferences is driving the clash? And if you've got the map and you've got the idea of what these particular behavioral preferences are and your own profile, you can very quickly see, the gap's coming up because we have a different approach when it comes to expressiveness, or because you're being very direct in your communication style and I'm not. So then you can have a really open, if it's an open conversation within the team and you've got the same language of behavioral preferences, you can really talk about it. So what is our ways of working and our ways of communicating? You can get really explicit. What are expectations? What are the associated behaviors and norms that we want to create as a team? What are the boundaries around that? What if I feel like you're overstepping the mark on the boundaries? How do I feed that back to you and let you know that? And this is where you then get very practical about it. And it might feel like taking time to state obvious things. These things are not obvious. They're the small things that can derail teams. And I've seen it, like the slight irritations that build up into frustrations that then get into they are so, they always, they never. And we get into our biases around what we're thinking about the other. And this is so critical in the work of cultural intelligence, whether we're looking at gender or whatever lens we're looking at, is just recognizing, hit the pause button there, listen to your dialogue, even if it's the inner dialogue, and then really recognize what's the choice, what's the next action or step you're going to take to really just address this. What are the ways that you want to work together, and get really explicit about that?
I love that, because I actually think organizations particularly are so nuanced in terms of it's so much is assumed. And what you're talking about is really getting rid of those assumptions and getting it crystal clear as to what is expected. Because, of course, the definition of an upset is an unfulfilled expectation, or, it's one that's been not expressed and then it hasn't been met and you're upset about it. So by actually making your expectations really clear, you're less likely to have upsets. And I can totally get that in some ways, someone who's abrupt, who I might see as abrupt, might be very forthright, might be very straight in their communication, which has its strengths, but it's also knowing when do you dial that up and when do you need to dial that down, and being explicit about what people's needs are.
Definitely. And just adding one final thought on that story. I mean, I worked a lot in Germany, in Russia, that not everybody, again, I don't want to stereotype, but generally the communication style is more direct. And I remember having a conversation with somebody once and about this in a slightly joking way. And what they said to me is, well, the problem is I don't know what you think, because I find you're not expressing it. So I'm trying to be really honest with you about what I think, whether it's positive or negative. But I don't know what you think, because you're kind of being indirect. So I can't decode it. I can't work out what you mean. And that's the thing. We often see it from how we are seeing what's going on, but there's always another angle to this. And that's what we have to bear in mind.
Yes. And as you're talking, I'm thinking these are life skills. They're not just business skills and leadership skills. These are skills that help you in your life. I bet with your family and your partner, it's helpful.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. but I'm also not perfect. So I want to kind of really bring this point in, which is sometimes I'm working with leaders who find this really tricky because they've got a leadership style that served them incredibly well in one context, cultural context. They've been very successful. And suddenly they're in a new cultural context, either working across borders, across cultures, or in a new, very diverse team. And what has worked really well for them before is not working for them so well anymore. And that's really hard because you kind of think, why isn't it working? Why am I not being as impactful, as effective? And, equally with my own example, sometimes what I'm doing isn't effective with my own family. And that's the point. You can't control everything. And sometimes it's about the strategy, CQ strategy about part of this is about experimenting. It's trying and seeing what's going to land. It's about making mistakes. Sometimes you will not get it right. And you might not find the way to connect with somebody, but you won't know unless you try. And this is why it's ultimately about CQ action as the final piece. You have to take an action and see whether it makes a difference or not, and then adjust from there.
Beautifully put. Thank you. That's great. So let's just talk a bit more about adaptation, because you talk about it's not just the minority that need to adapt, and they shouldn't be expected always to adapt. You talk about shared adaptation. Can you tell me a bit more about what that's about?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I mean by this is that I really I find it hard when it's kind of the idea that the responsibility of adaptation sits with one individual or one group who are considered the minority within that group. For me, this work is most powerful when everybody leans into the adaptation. And that means, therefore, everybody understands and has the same language to talk about difference, but they also understand what their personal action is, what they're going to do about it. And I think this is really important because otherwise it can feel like that burden is being held by the people who are different, who are outside, who are the other. And I don't think that's how it should be. In fact, it also is part of, when it works well, it's part of the full team to say, maybe there is something in the way you're doing things, the way you're communicating that we can bring in. And a brilliant example of this is I was working with an organization in Estonia recently, went over to Tallinn for a few days to work with the leadership team as they're expanding across the UK, across Europe. And what they were saying is, maybe sometimes one of the people was saying, well, we have more of a direct communication style. Maybe we're going to flag. I'm going to be more Estonian right now. I'm going to say it really directly. So that's a really nice example of not adapting, but also flagging. What behaviors are you demonstrating in this situation? What are you choosing to do? Not adapting, but showing that you're going to do it in a different way. And I think, again, having that openness to flag, what mode are you in? How are you engaging? And therefore, what can you expect of me in this interaction is also super helpful, because people sometimes misinterpret the intention behind the behavior, behind the communication. So making your intention clearer just helps others in the team to understand it as it's meant, not as how they see it.
What a great way to manage expectations as well, just by being that in that moment, flagging, I'm going to be like this right now. You really are managing people's expectations very, very well there. Great. So I'm just got one more question in relation to this, particularly around gender. So how can global organizations create gender equity without placing the burden on women? Because often it feels like this is about fixing the women rather than fixing the issue that there is in the system.
Yeah.
How can organizations be better at that?
Wow, this is the big question, right? But I think we've touched on some of these points through this conversation. So, it's not about, as I say, one group of people within the organization to change. It's about the full organization embracing this and understanding, why do we need to all adapt? And that's about aligning it, CQ drive, to the first capability, aligning it to why, aligning it to the mission, the strategy, the values of the organization. It's making sure people have the knowledge, the language to describe difference, for example, through the behavioral preferences. It's about having the strategies, allowing people the freedom to adapt and try different approaches, and then demonstrating with action. And action is both bottom up and it's top down. It's from the beginning of a employee journey as they enter the organization, as I'm so pleased to hear, I'm doing with one organization right now in their induction program, and then helping them at different stages of their career really embed this in. And for me, that is the absolute ideal when you've got organizations embracing it fully and understanding cultural intelligence isn't just a tick box. It isn't just an awareness exercise. It's an action. That's the key thing.
Yes. And where do you think, think about, we'll have people listening to this podcast who may be HR directors, they may be senior leaders who are leading the whole organization. Where is the place to start?
That is a brilliant question. Obviously, I would love it if it was at every level within the organization, but I would be tempted to say it has to come from the senior leaders. They have to be demonstrating that commitment to that personally, individually, as well as the collective. That's true, particularly for organizations that are hierarchical traditionally, have some level of power distance in them. But yes, I think coming from the senior leadership team, showing the example, the commitment about why it matters to them personally as well. I think it's actually, if they are open enough to talk about that, I think it's also about understanding it's not just about the organization, it's also about personal commitment too.
And, you've worked with lots of different organizations, helping them develop their culture and their cultural awareness. What does success look like?
Success for me looks like that people are openly talking about this within the organization, within the teams, that they are able to diagnose their own cultural clashes, because we're not going to suddenly not have these miscommunications and frustrations going on. But what you'll be able to do is have people go, I understand what's going on here. The behavioral preference that's playing out here is this one. I'm like this, you're a bit more like that. I can see now why this is happening. Let's have an open conversation about how we communicate on this issue, and designing conversations and making it happen. For me, that's success. If that's happening at all levels within the organization, that is going to be a culturally intelligent organization.
Yes, and what I'm hearing is the ability to address differences and conflict really intelligently.
Yes.
Is definitely a measure of that, isn't it? Victoria, this has been a really, really fascinating conversation. So I just would love you to pass on your one final piece of wisdom to people that are listening to this episode. When it comes to culture and gender, what would that one tiny piece of information be? Or it might be tiny, but it might have a big impact.
Absolutely. I think, from everything we've talked about today, I'm going to cheat and say there's two, actually. Cultural intelligence is everybody's responsibility. That is the first thing. And I think the other thing is cultural intelligence is an action, not knowledge or awareness. So that requires you to do something with it. And I think those are two thoughts that I'd love people to take away from today.
I love that. So it actually isn't something that you keep up here in your head. You actually do go and take some action to make that difference in your own organization and in your own lives as well, because it applies to life as well, I would suggest. Victoria, how can people connect with you?
Well, I'm very much on LinkedIn. I'm often sharing my thoughts, ideas, strategies over there. Feel free to connect with me over there. Come and listen to the podcast. And of course, if people want to deep dive into this topic, it is part of my book, Become a Global Leader. So again, very welcome to pick up a copy and let's build the conversation. If people are interested in this, want to learn more, what does this mean and look like for their organization and team? Really happy to connect, have a conversation and talk more.
Yeah, I love it. And I think what is so fantastic is culture is so often forgotten about because we're swimming in it. And we don't see it.
Yes.
And yet it is having such an impact on how we show up and how we behave and how we interact with one another. So becoming more conscious of that culture is going to have such a big impact. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today, Victoria.
Thank you, Mary. I've really enjoyed this conversation and really appreciated your very thoughtful questions. So thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for listening to the She Leads Collective podcast. If this episode resonated with you, follow the show or share it with a friend and leave a quick review below. Or leave us a comment. Change happens through conversation, so let's keep this one going. Listen out for the next episode and join me as we keep lifting the lid on the stories that matter. Take care and keep leading with heart.